Hey everyone, so in our quest to kind of design the smartest flying machine, the one that knows exactly where it is at all times and can stop at just the right location without us having to tell it to do anything, we've kind of always run into this problem. In order for any of these super smart flying machines to know where they are in space and stop at the right moment, they need to be able to count distance. And although counting things in Minecraft is generally pretty trivial, the fact that we have to build this on top of a moving flying machine ends up being a pretty big task. This ends up getting so complicated that either we have to resort to making incredibly slow, clunky, giant flying machines like this one I designed, or we end up having to choose a slightly more unorthodox fuel source, and in turn we get still a pretty slow flying machine and very limited distance. So it seems like the fundamental crux of all of our issues is that we're building on a moving machine, and this is really limiting us. So why don't we just take the timer and take it off of the machine? And sure, we could just tear the timing mechanism off of the machine and just, forget about it. And sure, the flying machine will absolutely continue to fly, but now we have a new problem. This solution sucks in the same way that you can't make a car lighter by tearing out the engine. The thing is that you kind of need that. This flying machine, with absolutely no timing mechanism, is just about as good as any. It's just going to fly into the distance and never stop, which is the whole point of what we're trying to do here. So that's our seemingly simple dilemma. You have to put the timer on the flying machine to make it actually useful, but putting on the timer of the flying machine makes it super big, clunky, and awful. But what if I told you there was another way? If it were somehow possible to communicate to the flying machine wirelessly no matter where it is, it gives us access to build a timer using a bunch of components that are completely unavailable on flying machines due to being immovable or just breaking off. But now we have an even newer problem. See, when people think about wireless redstone, they often think of machines that look a little bit like this. This is by far probably the oldest wireless redstone design in existence, developed by the original person who discovered it, 202 name. But the thing I'm paying attention to here is the fact that this thing is not going on a flying machine. Not even thinking about the complexity of the mechanics and the sheer size alone, there is simply no way that we could ever slap a wireless receiver directly onto a flying machine. At least if we're using wireless redstone in the conventional sense. The interesting reality is that other forms of wireless redstone absolutely do exist. They're just often not used because they don't really apply to all the situations that people are normally using wireless redstone for. But for us, we've got a special case, which is why we're going to be using wolves. More specifically, tamed wolves will teleport you just about wherever you go. And this will happen regardless of how far you travel. If I go ahead and teleport 1,000 blocks away, they're still going to teleport to me. Another super important detail is that wolves that are attached to fence posts via a lead actually don't teleport. Which means that if we simply attach this fence post with a lead to a sticky piston, we can actually actuate whether or not this wolf is going to teleport to us by simply extending the piston. And what this series of discoveries actually means is that all we need to be able to create wireless redstone is a simple fence post, piston, and a way of detecting when a dog teleports to me while I'm in the flying machine. Conventionally, when it comes to detecting entities in really any fashion, we use either pressure plates or tripwires. The thing is, they're reliable and they work very well, but once again, we're on a flying machine. This is not something we have access to. The one other possible idea that does work on a flying machine is chests and detector rails. But see, here's the thing, is this idea is so clunky because we have to somehow predict where the wolf is going to spawn and somehow get it to nudge the chest minecart in a way that pushes it over a detector rail. I'm going to be honest, I was totally not digging the chest minecart next to detector rail setup, so I basically just abandoned it from the start and tried to think of a new solution. Our next best pathway to possibly take in order to make this work is utilizing the player. We've used it before for a lot of things, and actually we're going to be building off of the hoe-based flying machine. You see, here's the thing, our previous design was entirely dependent on whether or not this player could use its hoe on this piece of dirt. Now, if something were to stop the player from using the hoe on the dirt, like it breaking for example, then the flying machine would stop. But we can use another obstruction. If we happen to make these two spots in front of me the only two spots that wolves can teleport to, when they do, Then suddenly we've got our obstruction we need. The player can no longer hoe the dirt, and the flying machine's going to stop. In fact, we actually don't even need the hoe at all, because if we go ahead and just do a simple note block setup, we can accomplish the same thing without having to worry about durability. So now that we understand how this thing is supposed to work, let's isolate our problems. We've got two problems. Number one, how do we make it so that the wolf exclusively teleports directly in front of us and not on any other space? And how do we design a flying machine that is dependent on us pressing this note block? Let's start with problem number one. See, it's actually kind of pretty difficult to control the way wolves teleport, because they're willing to choose just about any surface that has a solid top face. For my testing, they pretty much have zero qualms about what you're putting under their feet, except for one tiny little exception. See, wolves are not going to teleport to any block that they know is going to actively damage them. This makes sense because it doesn't really make sense for them to spawn and immediately start dying, so they're not going to choose to teleport to magma blocks as they're not fire resistant. Conveniently too, magma blocks are also very much movable, which makes them seem like sort of the holy grail for what we're going to be doing. But there's a small issue. If we go ahead and fix the piston setup and then go ahead and freeze the game, break this magma block, and then step forward in time 3 ticks, as you can see this piston starts pushing them. Now we know these are moving magma blocks, but when the game is pushing them, they actually transition into a block called block 36. And wolves don't know that these blocks are going to become magma blocks and eventually be a damage source. That means that if we go ahead and splash these wolves with fire resistance, in order to keep them safe, teleport them onto the ground, and then we go over here and turn on this clock. If we shuffle this floor back and forth, these wolves have no qualms about teleporting to this magma surface. For the brief moment that it is moving, they completely perceive it as a normal block that they can stand on without being hurt. Unfortunately, this renders the magma block completely useless since all of our flying machines are going to be moving 100% of the time, so we're not going to be using them. Luckily though, we won't need it, because the thing is if we make this front of the flying machine just super thin, and we stick the player right at the front, the only remaining spaces for the wolves to teleport to are the exact places that we want it to. By the way, this tiny little fence gate dongle here at the top, it's completely useless. I'll explain why it's in pretty much every single design except for the last one. It's based on a complete misunderstanding I had of how wolves work, and we don't need it anymore. Okay, first actual design. This thing is a total piece of garbage. The way it's supposed to operate is every time you hit this note block, it's going to move everything forward. This top mechanism simply lets this minecart really slowly ride down this rail, and as long as the machine stays moving, this minecart should keep off of the detector rail, as so. If it does manage to do this, then it essentially gets stuck, and then this piston is going to block the rest of the flying machine's travel. We ended up totally scrapping this idea though, because you see the entire thing relies on really unreliable mechanics. The stopping mechanism is unreliable, this mechanism is unreliable since you just kind of have to keep hitting it and sometimes it doesn't work properly, stopping the machine. Ultimately, this thing was kind of doomed to fail. After ditching that terrible design, I came up with a new concept that would actually work. So here's the thing, this is a perfectly normal flying machine, except it can't move forward because this piston is trying to push 13 blocks. The only way it can move forward is if this line of blocks moves forward, and that is only being facilitated by the fact that this player is spamming this note block here. This allows it to keep flying forward. A really neat quirk with this is that we're still able to move this piston despite it being constantly firing, because if we actually look at when it moves, we move the observer up top first, and then the piston. This results in a brief period where the piston is no longer firing, which allows us to move it. Then I sort of fleshed out the design slightly more, made it look more like what we're looking for, and then I gave it an actual engine. And if we go ahead and fling this thing off with that carpet bot over there, continually pressing that note block, as you can see, that this red block continually gets moving forward, preventing the machine from stopping. However, if I were to act as the wolf in this situation and just go ahead and drop right here, I block the player from accessing the note block, and the machine totally shuts down. As a sort of side interjection before we move on to the final design, if you're liking the video so far and you want to see the other content that I'm putting out, make sure to subscribe, it helps a ton. Anyways, basically the whole deal with this final design is that we finally freshened up everything and fixed all the tiny little holes that I thought wolves would be able to teleport into. This is also the point we're going to talk about why did we have this little dongle thing here. Well, this was based on the previous conception that wolves would teleport directly where the player is standing and kind of push you off the thing, and that would hurt. Apparently, wolves don't even teleport within a kind of 2-block radius of you, which means that we don't even need any extra obstructions here, and we can sort of just stick whatever we want here. These are the only few platforms that actually matter for wolf teleportation. Alright, so we've got the final design, now let's talk about how you use it. First off, you want to set up a rig that looks a little bit like this, where you can hit a button, start the flying machine, and now you're already in position to start hitting this note block. The rig should also be hooked up to this timing system, and in this case, I'm just using a simple hopper clock that will trigger after a very long time, in which it will remove a single item from this top chest and move it to the bottom one. When this thing is completely empty, it's going to simply push this post, and that is going to cause all the wolves to try and flock towards me, jamming up the machine. So, let's do a trial run. I've gone ahead and set up the machine for incredibly low timer settings just to show you that it can't stop, but you can input any amount of time you want and it'll still work. So, if I go ahead and get into the machine, switch into survival mode, and start it up, we'll go ahead and start moving forward, and then in about 10 seconds, that piston on my right is going to trigger, and all the wolves are going to teleport to us, and stop the machine. If we take a look at what happened, pretty much exactly what we wanted to happen happened. This red block never actually moved forward since we are no longer powering it with this piston, causing this lower section to jam up, which in turn immediately jams up the engine. Even though this thing is technically the fastest of my smart flying machines and technically the most practical, I definitely don't expect anybody to actually use it, so I'm not going to get into the details of how you might actually time it. I mean, you just take the time it takes for this engine to move one block, multiply that by the amount you want to travel, and then figure out how long each of these cycles takes and put the correct number of items in this chest. It's fairly straightforward, and the only thing that matters is that it theoretically could be used to travel some sort of hypothetical distance. So, what did we learn? I know that I said that the series thing would eventually come to an end, but every single time I release a new video, I come up with another really stupid way to make this idea work. But until I run out of ideas, we're gonna still keep making these things, and we'll still keep flying off into the distance for extremely specific amounts of time. As for what we actually learned, besides the fact that the series is going to probably never die, it's that Mojang has implemented a bunch of really random mechanics, but if we learn to use them right, we can scrape out a ton of actual usefulness out of every single one of them. This is heavily foreshadowing because I'm pretty sure that this flying machine concept can be done with Thorn's armor somehow, and I'm going to try and figure out how to make that work. Anyways, that'll be the end of the video. If you like my stuff, make sure to check out the other flying machines that I've worked on, as well as a bunch of the other projects that I put my time into. If you want to see more content and be notified of that, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.